Okay, so we wrap up lesson 8. We start off with the early fight for labor rights. All right. As we head out of the 1700s and into the early 1800s with our first industrial revolution in America, the North is going to grow as an industrial manufacturing hub. Why? What factors make the North a good place for manufacturing? Okay, you're on the right path there. Close to what? Hang in here with me. Close to? You're not far out there. Proximity to the Atlantic, right? They're urban centers, and most of those urban centers, places like Boston and New York, have well-established harbors that you can easily trade from. Also, a lot of the rivers in the Northeast are fast-moving. Why do you need fast-moving rivers to establish factories? What type of technology is powering your factories? Water. Very good. Mill wheels. Excellent job. Well done. Okay, so in these northern factories, we have long hours, low wages, conditions are unsafe and unhealthy. No real unions exist yet, but I do want you all to know there is some small skilled labor union movements, and I actually added this for you guys, so you might want to take note of this in your notes. The Federal Society of Journeymen Cordwainers is your first union, and journeyman cordwainers is a very fancy way to say that these two groups of skilled craftsmen have unionized. Tanners and cobblers. Bless you. What does a tanner do? What type of skilled labor? Leather work. Very good. Cobblers? What do they make? Shoes. Very good. That would be a mason. Would it work? Do stonework? It's okay though. Appreciate you being bold. Okay? Shoemakers. All right? So they're the first to unionize in Philly in 1794. Child labor made up roughly 50% of the workforce in the Northeast in the early 1800s. And the abuses of children were horrible. And a big part of that abuse was they did not have the ability to get what? What can they not receive? That you're all receiving right now. They don't get an education, right? And this is a cyclical problem, you know? Like these kids their education ends about the time that they're like 8 to 12 years old. They go into the labor force at a very young age. If they don't work themselves to death, they end up having children, and this cycle just goes on and on and on, right? And it's not just like physical abuses, like getting hurt on the job and losing fingers and limbs. It's also like the mental abuse of this as well, right? Like these kids are like horribly depressed. This is actually really tragic too. There's like really high rates of alcoholism among children in the labor force in this period of time, which seems weird, but there's no laws against kids consuming alcohol in this period. So this is a pretty rough situation. All right. Adult working conditions improved a little bit in the 1820s and 30s, mainly because the vote was available to white males over the age of 21. No longer did you have to own land. So this does improve some of the labor rights, but not on a large scale. We're not going to start seeing major improvements to labor and labor rights until we get after the American Civil War. So we'll talk more about that as we move forward. 10-hour work days, sometimes longer, as long as maybe 14 to 16 hours, but it was typically like somewhere around a 10 to 12-hour workday. Some higher wages, but not always. It kind of depends on the people they're working for. More tolerable conditions depending on who they're working for. We also see a rise in public education in this period of time, but it's mainly confined to the north, and it's also more widespread in urban centers. The South will be lagging behind in public education at this period of time. Any idea about what age your formal education typically ended in this period of time in the American South? How old? About 10 to 12. Yeah. About a sixth grade education, that was the norm. Now, if you were from wealth, then you would receive a secondary education and have the ability to go on to college, but that was still pretty limited. What we're about to head into in lesson 9 is the Second Great Awakening, and we're going to start to see changes in public education and higher education as a result. A number of workers went on strike, but worker strikes that were put down were either done through violence or they were done through hiring people that would actually step in and take the jobs. This period of time coincides with large waves of Irish and German immigrants coming to America. So, especially in urban centers, a lot of the immigrants were coming in and they were starving and destitute, especially in the 1840s, what was happening in Ireland. Anybody remember? Very good. Potato famine. So a lot of people are going to come in and they're willing to work for next to nothing. Bless you. Which creates a lot of tension in urban centers. Irish and German immigrants moving into cities leads to the rise of the Know Nothing Party, the nativists. They hated immigrants coming in. They were anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, anti-German in many cases. We do see the formation of some more labor unions by the 1830s, but one of the big problems for unions is when the Panic of 1837 hit, a lot of those unions just kind of fell apart. Now we'll see another union resurgence occur heading up to the Civil War, then that one kind of falls apart. The union movement, sort of the modern union movement as we know it, doesn't really happen until after the Civil War. We'll talk more about that as we move forward in the course. In Lowell, Massachusetts, remember Francis Lowell was the competitor of Samuel Slater, who was the guy behind the first textile mill up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. The Lowell mills were established in Lowell, Massachusetts. They hired a lot of young single women. You will be proud to know, ladies, that these women actually had one of the earliest and most successful labor strikes in American history. They went on strike for higher wages, and they actually won their strike peacefully, which was pretty amazing for this period of time. Really important court case. Remember, if it's italicized and it has a V in the middle, it's a court case. Commonwealth v. Hunt. Now, this one is settled in the Massachusetts Supreme Court. It doesn't have to go through the appeal process to go to the federal Supreme Court. What this allowed people to do it allowed for the legalization of unions and allowed for peaceful and honorable protest for organized labor. So that's a huge victory for American labor. We also need to remember, whether you like, love, or hate the idea of unions, and I'm not trying to sway you one way or the other, but whether you like, love, or hate them, you need to understand that our most basic labor rights in America have been gained through blood being spilled in the streets of this nation over a 200-year period. Like our most basic rights. Like, who loves a weekend, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, at this period of time, you would have worked, and even after the American Civil War, how many days would you typically work? 6, yeah. Most employers only gave one day off, Sunday, yeah, the Sabbath. So the effectiveness of unions in the early 1800s was pretty minuscule compared to what we see later on. There's also, this becomes problematic, the issue of scabs. Have you ever heard of this term before? Okay, so like, if you've never heard of this term, imagine this. I'm a factory owner. You're all my employees. I'm a horrible person. And you all are like, enough's enough. Down with Mr. East Factory. We're moving on. We're going to go on strike. Yeah. And I'm like, cool, guys. And I walk out the door, and I find 30 people to replace you. And they walk right by you into my factory. And now you just have no job. That is a group that we refer to as scabs. Does this kind of thing still happen? It does. It definitely happens. Do you have any skiers out there? Okay. Are y'all familiar with Park City, Utah? Recently, the employees in Park City went on strike for higher wages. What did Park City do? They brought in personnel from other resorts to take their jobs temporarily. That's a scab. Okay, so any questions about labor rights? So this is what the wool mills look like on the left. This picture comes later because we're on like the very, like, at this period of time, this is like the very early introduction of photography. So this image on the right comes much later. This is actually one of the earliest images captured of child labor in textile mills. I'm going to be explaining this in the post-war era, post-Civil War era, in the Progressive era and Gilded Age. All right. Highways and steamboats, improvements in transportation were needed, not only to transport people, but also goods and raw materials, because America is now becoming an industrial nation. I wouldn't say we're an industrial power yet. We'll get into that as we move forward. The Lancaster Turnpike, major road from Philadelphia to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This allows for not only the growth of economic trade, but it also puts into effect toll systems. How many people out there have ever gone through a toll? All of you, right? At some point, you've gone through a toll. This starts a trend in America to interconnect the states by not only establishing turnpikes, but also the ability to establish toll systems to raise revenue. Question for you. How many people, this is a trick question, how many people have gone through a turnpike? Every single one of you. And you didn't even know it. How many? Correct. Very good. The Midlothian Turnpike is one of the oldest turnpikes. That is Route 60. That connects Midlothian to the western side of the state. It actually goes through my hometown, Clifton Forge. Route 60 goes across the state. That was a turnpike. How many people have gone south to North Carolina? And then you guys have to decide, where are you going to go? Are you going to go straight down 95? Are you going to branch off to 85? Or are you going to go off and get on 460? What are you going to do? That's a turnpike. Anybody ever gotten off down in Chester, Route 10? Spins you out and spits you into Chester, and you can go Route 10 toward Hopewell, or you can take Route 10 toward Chester. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? That's a turnpike. So you have all types of turnpikes all around you that have been around for a long time. They've just been improved upon. One of the most important advancements in road technology occurs in the first industrial revolution, and that's called the Macadam Road. It was invented by a guy named John L. Macadam. So here's the premise. At this period of time, most of your roads are made of what? Dirt. Good. Or they're made of logs. Those were called corduroy roads. Okay? So imagine if I just cut down a bunch of trees and lined them up, right? And then we packed mud down on top of them, and now we've created a road. But if we get heavy rains and that washes out, what's it going to be like if you're riding on those logs? Anybody ever had a pair of corduroys and they take their finger across them and go? No? Really? Yeah, corduroys. So those were corduroy roads. Why is this dangerous for a horse? They could, even worse, break their leg. And what happens when horses break their legs? They typically have to be put down. So people, we don't have cars yet. So people are like, all right, the corduroy roads are dangerous. Dirt roads are dangerous. So this guy comes about, McAdam, and the premise is you take gravel and you put gravel, crushed rock, or crush and run, as it's called, down, and then you cover it in tar and you let that dry and harden. We often refer to this as what? Asphalt, right? Sometimes you'll hear this called tarmac. That's why it's called tarmac, because they use tar, and he's the guy that invented it. Do I have any people with family in Pennsylvania? You got family in PA? You got family in PA? There's a decent chance that somebody in your family in Pennsylvania probably refers to hard asphalt surface as macadam. I got family up there and family that's down here now, and they'll be like, yeah, the macadam. And I'm like, asphalt, right. We just didn't grow up using that term for asphalt, but a lot of them did, because those were some of the first macadam roads invented in America. We're actually not done with this. We're going to talk about the impact of the macadam road during the Civil War as well. Isn't that interesting? I find that very interesting. All right, cool. Federal government constructed the Cumberland Road. This is also known as the National Road. Remember, this was kind of like the brainchild of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay through the American system. This was used through both state and federal monies. This is now Route 40. I don't know if you've ever been on it. If you've been north into Maryland or PA or, I don't know, Ohio, it connects Baltimore to Indianapolis now. It's pretty long. The National Road's it's a long trek. Robert Fulton invented the steamboat, the Clermont, in 1807, and by 1830, steamboats were common everywhere. He did have a competitor. His competitor's name was Henry Shreve. But what did Robert Fulton beat Henry Shreve to? The patent. Very good. He got the patent. So he's the guy that gets the credit. Steamboats increased U.S. trade, not only on rivers, but also globally. Why do you have to worry less about weather now? Not that bad weather couldn't sink a steamboat. What do you have to, weather-wise, worry less about?
You need to worry about wind.
Wind. Very good, right? This is like kind of legit time travel. You also have to have less worry about currents. This is like time travel. Like if you were sailing across the Atlantic, it could take you like 2 months, somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks. Steamboat, take you 2. All right, that's revolutionary. But it was dangerous. I mean, steamboats exploded all the time. But that's the risk of ingenuity. Yeah, where people are like, cool, I'm willing to risk it all to get on the steamboat to get where I need to go faster. We'll see people do this with trains. We'll definitely see people do this with airplanes. I mean, I don't know when the last time you guys got onto an airplane, but I'm sure the last time you got onto a plane, you weren't like, well, I'm going to die today. No, you just get on a plane and fly. But think of like how long it took to get to the ingenuity and advancement that we have today in flight. They're dealing with the same thing with steam power at sea and also on land with locomotives. Really important takeaway. New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, he had run for president, didn't work out. He ran for president against Madison and was not elected. He actually stayed involved in New York politics for the rest of his political career. He is going to propose the construction of the Erie Canal. This is a canal that connects the Hudson River all the way to Lake Erie. Most of his critics believed this was an absolute joke. It would never be achieved. They called it DeWitt's Ditch or DeWitt's Folly. But in the end, it ends up becoming one of the greatest feats of engineering in American history. Because what it leads to is a market revolution. The price of goods and the price of travel plummet. It also leads to the creation of new cities. Buffalo, where my Bills fans at. Rochester, okay? Syracuse, Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan. I mean, Detroit was just kind of like, still like a bit of a fort until the Erie Canal really helps it take off. Also, these offshoot canals from the Erie Canal create this sort of interconnected canal system that leads to the growth of what major city in the Midwest? Kind of. I'm looking for a different one. That's a good guess. Chicago. Very good. Canals didn't hurt St. Louis, but really what helped St. Louis was the Louisiana Purchase, because Ohio connected the mess. Yeah. St. Louis grows. And then you start to have like large waves of immigration coming into St. Louis. You have this huge boom of German settlers that are going to go out and like settle in Cincinnati and settle in St. Louis. That's why St. Louis was such like a big brewing capital, because of all the Germans that wound up there. All right. So there's another canal system that I'm going to talk about too. There's actually two others that I'm going to talk about other than the Erie. I'm going to talk about the Wabash, and I'm also going to talk about the Kanawha. But before that, this is your Erie Canal. It connects from the Hudson to Lake Erie, and then you see these other offshoot canals that are established around, and then that's Lockport up there that we started our lesson with, and then that's DeWitt Clinton, governor of New York, that pushed for the building of the canal. This is pretty insane, right? Look at all of these canal systems. They're all where? Except for one. In what region? They're up where? North. These canal systems are up north. One southern canal system. And fortunately for you, at any given time, you can, if you have nothing going on, drop what you're doing and quickly go visit it. Where is that southern canal system? Where? Yeah, go for it. Where is it? Be bold. Where's the only southern canal system that you can still visit? That they dredged it right now, but they'll put the water back in there and you can get out on a little boat cruise. Nobody? Nothing? Really? It's in Richmond. The Kanawha Canal. It connected Richmond all the way to my hometown, Clifton Forge. There was a time in my little tiny hometown before it became a train town, the little creeks that run in and around my town were dammed up to be able to move what goods to Richmond? What natural resources? Eventually coal, yes. Lumber, good. And iron. Okay? So they would move these goods down the James River. Like the little town below my town is called Iron Gate. That's the headwaters of the James. And they'd have these tributaries. Like the two rivers that make the James are the Calpasture and the Jackson, and they'd be moving all these goods downriver. All right? The goal was the Kanawha Canal in Richmond. They wanted the James River to connect to what river? Eventually, the Ohio. But what obstacle do they have to deal with here? Appalachia, right? So once we get into the Civil War, and after the Civil War, they're going to give up on the canal and say, what are we doing? Might as well build a railroad. And that will ultimately become the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, C&O, which better recognizable to you. Has anyone out there ever seen a train car that says CSX on it? And it probably has coal in some of those cars. That is the old Chesapeake and Ohio. All right. So, speaking of the Chesapeake and Ohio, which we'll talk more about later in the course, the Iron Horse, the American Railroad. Where is it invented though? Not in America, but where? What country? What country harnesses steam power? Well, I don't want to go all the way back to ancient Greece, but I'm looking for England, right? Don't want to get into the Greeks right now. But England in the first industrial revolution starts to harness steam power. It makes its way to America, not only in the form of steamboats, but also in steam locomotives, all right? The first railroad, or at least the concept of American railroad, is going to be introduced between 1827 and 1830. This is crazy. Within 30 years, by 1860, 30,000 miles of track will be laid in the U.S. 3/4 of that track will be in the north. All right? Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb was the first locomotive introduced in the United States in 1830. It raced a horse in Baltimore. The horse won the race, but a belt broke on the locomotive and it changed everything. Now people are like, I got to probably put my money into this. But this is a risky endeavor, right? This will ultimately lead to the first American railroad line, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, B&O. Now, if you did some research, you could say, wait a minute, there were railroad experiments going on in New York and other places in the north. Sure. But like the first legit rail line that led to interconnection was the Baltimore and Ohio. How many, do I have Orioles fans in the house? Anybody ever been to Camden Yards before? That's an old Baltimore and Ohio depot. Okay? Early key investor in railroads is Cornelius Vanderbilt. When he was younger than you, he got his first loan from his mother. Because remember, Dutch women could control their own private property. He rolls his money into shipping. Remember when we talked about Gibbons and Ogden and the shipping competition earlier in the lesson? He was tied into that. He got involved in shipping during the War of 1812 and made a fortune. When he sees this all going down, he becomes one of the first people to roll his shipping empire into a railroad empire, making him one of the wealthiest men that ever lived in America. We'll talk more about Vanderbilt later. So Vanderbilt University, you know what their mascot is? Anybody? The Commodores. The reason they're the Commodores is his nickname was the Commodore because he was a shipping tycoon before he was a railroad tycoon. Just throwing that out there. We'll talk more about Vanderbilt later. The railroads were originally opposed by a lot of financiers and investors, and a lot of banks didn't want to get involved because The canal systems are pretty new, right? Some of these canal systems are only like 10 to 20 years old when the railroad comes about, and a lot of people are apprehensive. Vanderbilt does something very smart. He starts to gobble up land that runs parallel to the canals. So we start to see rail lines running parallel to canals, and that ultimately the railroad system will overtake the canal system. Can you still visit these canal systems? Sure, but not all of them. You can still visit the canal or the Erie. Railroads early on were pretty dangerous in the early era. They caused a lot of house and brush fires because of burning embers that would fly off from the trains. Early trains were also poorly constructed, faulty brakes, derailments, human error, head-on collision. How many people have ridden on a train before? Thanks, sir. So about, 7 or 8 people in here. When you got on that train, did you ever once think, I'm probably going to die of a head-on collision? Never. Because you have, what we have now is called double tracking. You can go one way, and the other train goes the other, and there's no risk of you smashing into each other. All right? There's also a problem with gauge, okay? So here's a big problem with the interconnection of trains. Some states had a gauge that was like this wide. Other states had a gauge that was like that wide. What war is going to make standardized universal track gauge in America? Civil War. Civil War is a game changer for the Civil War and the railroad changed so much in American society that we don't even think about. Like, for example, time zones. Now, I know you're thinking, your scientific brain's like, wait a minute, Mr. E. Time zones exist because of the prime meridian. Yes. But standardized time zones did not exist prior to the Civil War. So a guy in Richmond and a guy in Charlottesville, their watches could be off by an hour. That's dangerous for train travel. That's why we move in the post-Civil War era toward a standardized time zone. Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific. To make sure everything's running on time and people aren't dying, even though people still died. So you're with us? All right, cool. All right. The growth of railroads and canals helped the growth of the industrial economy, supported westward movement, but we're not there yet for a transcontinental railroad. When's that get built? After the Civil War. All right? So, just to give you an idea, there's Peter Cooper, the Tom Thumb. He was a pretty interesting inventor. Anyone ever had Jell-O before? One of the inventors of Jell-O. Kind of strange. Don't want to talk about what Jell-O is made out of. Anyway, moving right along. That's the Tom Thumb. That's the first American locomotive. Check that out. That is a map of the dawn of the Civil War, showing you where the American railroad tracks existed. Look at the interconnection of the North compared to the lack of interconnection of the South. It's remarkable. Guys, this, as we go into the Civil War, that right there is one of the major advantages that they have heading into the Civil War. The ability to move goods and people quickly. Cool. That's all I've got. All right. Questions, comments, concerns? Everybody good? All right.